Good evening or afternoon to everyone from wherever you may be viewing or when you may be viewing. If you were expecting tonight Jennifer Richmond or Elizabeth Spivak, who are the typical hosts and strong presence on the Institute for Liberal Value broadcasts, I'm not either of them clearly, though I thank them for asking me to moderate tonight and for their insight and guidance in preparation. My name is Mark Cohn. I am the National Program Coordinator for the North American Values Institute, which is a partner of the Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm honored to moderate tonight's discussion, which they have honored and we are co-branding with Navi. It is called Instructing Animosity. Now, I suppose if there is a subtitle to the webinar this evening, it might be The Dangers, Pitfalls, Unexpected and or Unintended Consequences of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Programs. We are joined tonight by not one, not two, not three, but four outstanding panelists. So it will be, in no small part, my job to try to keep conversation going and flowing and somehow balanced by this thoughtful group of educators and researchers. Most of you are actually new to me, save Lee Jussum, whom I had the good fortune to interview on this very topic and study back in the late fall. I've enjoyed getting ready for tonight by reading some of you and your work and what you're doing. How you are so prolific is just astonishing and left me scrolling a lot. Thank you. So welcome to Nate Bork, Danette Finkelstein, Lee Jussum, and Ann Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, FYI, and not in any particular order, but I think it is wonderful that we have tonight individuals who are social psychologists, political extremism scholars. Now, that's not no political extremist, but a political extremism scholar, and scientists who try to keep us safe with their science, though readily expose unsafe science, and even an academic pirate. I will have each of you introduce yourself, so please take a minute to share with the folks at home your job title and the institution or institutions where you are connected, and also how your work gives you a unique perspective on this topic of DEI that has been in the news for a number of years now. But since the new presidential administration, it has graduated to front and center in order to be put to pasture, which we hope to discuss tonight, the dangers and the positive of that reality.
Oh my God.
With that, in no particular order, just because of where I see you on the screen, we're going to start with you, Ann, then we'll go over to Nate, and then we'll loop back around to Lee and to Danette.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm Ann Wilson. I am up in Canada at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'm a social psychologist, and I've been here for over 20 years. Main thing that I'm known for is research on self and identity over time, both individual self and groups. So our social identities and that sort of thing. That's ended up leading me to be interested in questions of social injustice and how people perceive and process inequality and think about those sorts of issues. And more recently, I've become really interested in both political polarization and some of the related things like our ability to talk across difference, constructive disagreement, and free speech.
Great.
I'm Nathaniel Bork. Nice to meet everybody. I'm currently at the University of Arkansas as a distinguished fellow doing a second PhD in education policy. My first was in political science and political theory, and I have a book under review based on the dissertation that basically looks at the progressive neoliberal model of education, trying to be multiple things at the same time, and sort of why that caused such a collapse in institutional trust of the university system. I'm also a visiting scholar at Rutgers.
Great, thanks.
I am Lee Jussum. I'm a distinguished professor of psychology. My field is social psychology. I've been doing research on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination for almost 40 years at this point. As polarization began to ratchet up in the United States, as both extremes started, the left extreme and right extreme started becoming more active, more in people's faces. it was obvious to me how many old perspectives on stereotypes and prejudice applied as well or more to politics as they do to things like race and sex. You combine that with the wave of social justice activism that sort of swept the country. Really, it started. It was a tide, an incoming tide, starting around 2010 or so, and then George Floyd's murder put it on steroids. And actually, in hindsight, the idea that a psychopathic cop murdering a black guy who, in the process of being arrested, would trigger a soft cultural revolution, in my opinion, is a tribute to how insane the country went.
Thanks, Lee. Denise?
Hi, I'm Denise Finkelstein. I am a PhD candidate at Rutgers University in the Social Psychology Department under Lee Jusson. And my research areas are authoritarianism, extremism, radicalization, things that relate to that are like stereotypes, demonization. And I just defended my master's thesis, which the subject of it was the Instructing Animosity studies. As of like a couple weeks ago. So.
Wow. Well, congratulations. I'm going through that. Well, let's start then with that. Danny, will you start us a little bit, giving us a sense of what led about the study, what led to this study? Because that is our jump off point for tonight, although we want to get further into DEI, of course, and topics off of that. But what prompted the study, and what were some of the takeaways that were immediate from that?
Sure. What really prompted the study was before I came to Rutgers to work under Lee, I was actually working for the Network Contagion Research Institute, where we track hateful and really corrosive ideas online. And we narratives and such. So we see we started seeing a lot of these narratives around George Floyd floating up on, Twitter, Facebook, around how oppressive, like white people can be. And like some of the narratives go to like a very extreme area. We also see things around caste, how Hindus are casteist, they are overtly racist. That was one of our narrative focuses. And we started we started with that, and then decided we would test some of these more extreme ideas from like Kindy and D'Angelo regarding race and anti-racism, and pulling also from literature from equality labs on caste and anti-Islamophobia, DEI trainings. So we looked at three. We had 3 studies that looked at race, Islamophobia, and caste narratives, to see if what different DEI framings around these kind of subject areas can do to people's perceptions, if they actually increase perceptions of caste or perceptions of racism or Islamophobia in places that are virtually devoid of it. If it like basically trains people to actually see this stuff, rather than actually making them less casteist or less racist or less Islamophobic. And that we tested for, if it actually, they demonize, white people, they demonize Hindus, if they demonize, excuse me, a little sick. We tested for demonization, we tested for prejudice, at how warm or cold they feel towards these groups in question that are being cast in an oppressive light, right? So like we're really testing anti-oppressive narratives and how they can actually cause a thing that they're supposed to, or quote, mitigate.
And what did you find once can you give us a case scenario? What did you bring people in order to test this out?
What was the question?
In other words, like in the scenario, I know one of the things that you tested with people is you have them read a paragraph of some material, and then ask them a question about admissions to college. Can you just explain that a little bit further? Better than I can articulate.
Okay, sure. For like example, we pulled from Kindy and D'Angelo's very famous and popular works, where they talk about how white people are inherently racist, America is inherently racist. We have, statements like that in a very brief, 250 word paragraph or so, where we just kind of load it with all of the like the very kind of like extreme rhetoric, about how, and then we basically ask them after participants read that very brief, paragraph, we give them a very, 2-sentence scenario. Eric
Can I jump in?
Williams,
Can I jump in?
What?
Let me just can I just jump in? Let me, because I have the report up. I just want to read to people an excerpt from what the participants in our study were exposed to. This is one thing to kind of describe it in the abstract. It's another to hear it in their own words. So what these were quotes from Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist and from D'Angelo's White Fragility. These books are all over DEI training and undergraduate, introductions to college. So we pulled together some of their statements and kind of fitted them together. So, and I'm just going to read a little bit. This is just the first of several paragraphs that half the people in the anti-racist DEI study read. White people raised in Western society are conditioned into a white supremacist worldview. Racism is the norm. It is not unusual. As a result, interaction with white people is at times so overwhelming, draining, and incomprehensible that it causes serious anguish for people of color. That went on for 3 paragraphs. Half the people read that kind of DEI rhetoric. The other half read an essay that was completely neutral. It was about growing corn in the United States. So that's what people were exposed to. Denise, back to you.
Well, since you have a report up, do you want to read the scenario that they read afterwards?
Oh yeah, okay. So they were exposed to either this Kendi D'Angelo rhetoric or the corn, and then we had them read this very, very short scenario. I'm like scrolling, trying to find it here. It's so short I can read the whole thing. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so and then everybody, whether they got the DEI rhetoric or the corn essay, they read this. A student applied to an elite East Coast university in fall 2024. During the application process, he was interviewed by an admissions officer. Ultimately, the student's application was rejected. That's it. That was everybody then was exposed to that scenario. Okay, now back to you.
Yeah, and then we asked them a series of questions afterwards. How many microaggressions did the student receive from the administrator during the interview? How biased was the administrator? How, my favorite one is, how violent was the administrator towards the student? So questions like that, and it turns out, people who read the Angela and Kindy one were more likely to perceive all of that had happened in the scenario, that had no evidence of any of that. No, violence, microaggressions. They just had said this must have happened, and sewed that into the scenario. On top of that, then we asked punishment questions about, should the administrator be punished? And people in the DEI, the anti-oppressive condition, on average, answered that yes, he should be punished. We had like 10 questions going from he should be fired, he should be made to apologize. There should be, a day of absence where white people aren't allowed on campus because of this, and all sorts of things. And, people were ready to go ahead and sign on to all that.
So let me ask a question in here, which is, all right, so the study comes out. Hopefully we got a decent lay of the ground. Anne and Nate, I'm looking at the two of you, and let's go in that order. How does this study land in the academic worlds that you operate in? And if you want to go first, and then we'll go with Nate. What's your take from your academic field on the study, and what are you seeing, or what are some of your colleagues in your respective universities saying about the NCRI study? Anne, you want to start us off?
Well, I can say that what are my colleagues saying? I haven't heard them say anything. And this is often what happens is there's kind of just a studious not paying attention to the stuff that goes against the narrative. Now, I haven't been paying close attention. It could be that there's more reaction than I've seen there. When I saw it, I thought it was really interesting, and it aligns with something that I've observed happening in a lot of different situations, more informally. But essentially, what you're getting at is attributional ambiguity, right? And I think that you call it the hostile attribution bias. But basically, if something happens, if someone doesn't get a job opportunity, if somebody doesn't get selected for an award, those kinds of things, we don't know for sure why that happened, right? So there are different attributions, and we have to figure out why it is. And the idea with some of these narratives, some of these DEI narratives, is that it can provide this one attribution. And if you just go with that attribution, you say, okay, well, if some negative outcome happened, then it must be because of discrimination. It must be because of bias. Then you're missing all of the steps in between, right? Of actually figuring out whether that really is the case. It's possible, right? So if you were to not get a job, then bias is one of a number of possible reasons why you didn't, but it's certainly not the only one, right? So the thing that I think is really interesting about this approach is that it's starting to really document that. I'll say one thing that I think would strengthen this package even further, which is one of the criticisms that I would have is that it could be that some of this is just basically sort of demand characteristics, right? That there's not a whole lot of information people are provided in those scenarios, those decision scenarios. And so it might be that they're just using this because you just gave them this passage about bias, and then it's the only thing that's really on their mind as a possible explanation. And I think some really cool additional research could be to really, like, if you give people, say, a resume or other information, so people actually do have more information to go on, then do they still end up attributing things to bias, even when there's ambiguous information to have to evaluate to a greater degree? So that's my reaction. I haven't seen a reaction from anyone else yet. So.
Yeah, so let me jump in here. So I agree with in every way. I agree with everything Anne has said. I want to amplify some of it, actually. So the study made a bit of a splash in sort of the conservative media and social media sphere. So the National Review reported it, and certain sort of, I mean, they weren't all sort of center to right sort of outlets were embracing it. It did get reported in the Times of London. So they weren't all right wing, but it did make a splash there. But it's had basically no. I mean, I think my colleagues in my department don't even know we did the study. So it's had no impact on academia. That has probably been worsened by Trump's taking a sledgehammer to everything academic, because now people have other fish to fry. Why would they pay attention to this when Trump is like uprooting the entire institutional sources of support for academia? And I can't blame them for not paying it. So that's number one. Number two, there are a slew of possible explanations for why we got it. One absolutely is demand characteristics, exactly as Anne described. And I further agree that, it behooves us to try and figure out what's going on. However, I don't mind if it's demand characteristics. Let's say the ultimate story is that this was all demand characteristics. To the extent that we got demand characteristics in a tiny little experiment where people had no connection to the experimenters and were responding anonymously, just imagine the power of those very same demand characteristics when your dean, provost, and president are screaming to you about how important DEI is and how we need to uproot systemic racism and white supremacy. So, if demand characteristics ends up being the explanation, I'm good.
So, Lee, it's just a shame you're not enthused by this topic. I mean, really, we just need to light a fire under this guy. So, Nate, can you chime in a little bit about what your reaction was and understanding? And can one of you professors, for our audience at home and the moderator, define demand characteristics so we understand what Nate, you want to take that one on?
So that's actually not part of my world, the demand part of it. Although I will say, tell you someone just happened to say last spoke. So actually I got involved in this because I was teaching at a community college in philosophy, and they used DEI as a shield to bring in like these outrageous administrative demands. Like I could only assign 8 pages of writing total per semester. I had to pass 80% of students by race and sex. I wasn't allowed to assign more white males than necessary in the philosophy course. And then really what I found out was a lot of this DEI stuff gets abused by administrators to basically try to generate revenue and profit. So there's a very cynical level to all this and how it actually gets implemented and used. And I think at this point, there's been such a negative shadow cast on DEI because of all these bad experiences and all these people abusing it, that's going to create all these sort of psychological effects that we're seeing.
So that's all really big, what you just said, right? Yeah. The impact. It's not if our goal is to create diversity. I do want us to try to define that term, by the way, in a minute. If our goal, a noble one, to create a diverse and rich learning environment, if and when it gets abused, then couple that with an administration that instead of bringing in nuance to a situation and complexity, uses the sledgehammer approach, suddenly everything gets thrown out. So how do you each, and we can just kind of do a quick round robin on it, how do you each define this term of diversity? How do you understand it? And in particular, in your academic settings?
Can I start?
Yeah, Nate, you start, please.
So there's 2 definitions here. One is the liberal tradition, which says diversity means treat everybody as an individual, right? Recognize that there's differences in every group. Whoever you meet should be treated as an individual, not as a member of their group, right, by sex or race. And we should bring in welcome people as individuals into all spaces within the liberal Enlightenment tradition. Then when they get into sort of critical theory application of the word diversity, then you're talking about all the different categories there are, but they all have to agree on certain narratives, right? It's not enough to quote Kendi, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. And to be anti-racist, you have to be anti-capitalist. And so then diversity is sort of like this wedging everybody into the same category to agree on the same thing to get these very left-wing progressive critical theory goals achieved.
Great, thanks. I'm going to come down the column over here. Lee, you're up next, and then Denny, you'll go next.
I have an essay on this at Unsafe Science on basically progressive disingenuousness around diversity. And that's because there's 2 meanings. And what progressives have done is sell to the public one meaning and deliver a completely different meaning. So there are 2 meanings. They're now, before about 2010, diversity meant one thing. It meant variety. Whether it's people or anything else. You could have a diversity of fruit or, diversity of pets, and you could have a diversity of people, which meant lots of different people. And around 2010, the dictionaries started to include a second meaning. The second meaning involves something like, there's variations on the wording, ensuring representation from underrepresented groups. And underrepresented itself has 2 meanings. There's a statistical meaning, which is also the original meaning. So if you conduct a study and you find, I don't know, 13% of the United States identifies as Black, and you only have 5% of Black people in your survey, Black people are underrepresented in your survey. You have 5, there should be 13. You could have underrepresentation of conservatives or liberals or Northeasterners or Southerners. Anybody hypothetically could be underrepresented if their statistical proportion is less than the population. But then there's a second meaning that has also been imported by the progressive left, which means basically oppressed. So what underrepresented means is synonymous with an oppressed group. And so if diversity means underrepresented groups, it means ensuring the representation of underrepresented, that is oppressed groups in whatever you're doing, hiring, admitting students, assigning fellowships, giving out grants, whatever it requires something. I mean, I'm not sure how you get there without what is in the United States illegal affirmative action. There's forms of affirmative action that are legal, right? Like outreach is legal, mentoring people is legal. Preferential selection based on characteristics that are protected by civil rights law, race, sex, ethnicity, nationality, religion, I might be missing one or two, to make decisions, whether they're admissions decisions or hiring decisions on those bases is illegal in the United States, except under very, very, very narrow conditions. And that, as far as I can tell, that's what diversity meant in academia. It meant, and this is why it was disingenuous. It was selling this idea of diversity in the initial sense. We're going to bring in lots of people, and if you look at the Supreme Court cases that legitimized diversity, they were not even primarily about race. If you look, they admitted that race was one of the many things you could count. But they extolled things like having traveled widely, having changed careers, that it's important in an educational context to have diverse people contributing to the life of the university. This is not race-based or sex-based or religion-based affirmative action. This is a much bigger thing. Mm-hmm. But what was delivered was under-the-table affirmative action.
Thank you. Denise, do you want to jump in? Anything to add on that?
Sure. Yeah. I pretty much agree with Lee there. And I can just describe what diversity looks like from, PhD students' perspective. And, in my program, everybody, there's many people of different backgrounds and colors, but everybody should think the same. Everybody pretty much, if that's what it's not diverse thought or diverse perspectives per se. I mean, perspectives is like, where you grew up at home, but it's everybody looks different, but everybody pretty much thinks the same. And, and goes along with like the main narratives that are prevailing in the academy right now.
Right. This is what we hear about sometimes, the idea that diversity is immutable characteristics, but not so much ideological ones. Anne, what do you got for us? You want to jump in on this?
So I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I'll try not to say the same thing. What can I add? So one thing I'll add, I'll make the case for the affirmative action version of diversity. And I'm in Canada where it's sometimes more legal, right? And this is also what I think a lot of academics are thinking about, which is, the best case for that is the case where the homogeneity that you see, the lack of diversity that you see in some organizations, is actually not achieved due to the amazing merit of all of the people who happen to be in all the top spots over the last 30 years, but rather, some systems of discrimination and advantage, disadvantage that have ended up leading to the patterns that we see. So if you think of increasing diversity of underrepresented groups or groups that have experienced disadvantage as equaling the playing field, potentially giving people a leg up. If there are two equal candidates, then you give the advantage to the person who comes from a disadvantaged background, that sort of thing. That's one way of thinking about it. And that's one that would come from kind of a justice perspective, right? The idea that there can be something that's about sort of rebalancing the fairness by seeking that kind of diversity. The other perspective on diversity, and it's one that I think is fairly compelling, is one that's more about, and Lee says that this is the claim, but not the reality, but more about actually trying to get a more diverse population so that people have different perspectives. They come from different backgrounds. Sometimes, you hear the term lived experience in critical theory, and although I think that can sometimes be not. We can talk about what lived experience means, but the sort of best case version of that is the idea that people come from different backgrounds and experiences and are going to bring different things to the table because of the life experiences that they have. I think that's actually really consistent with ideological diversity, right? So in an ideal world, ethnicity, gender, all of those sorts of things would go along with differences in, diversity due to class, to ideology, and other things like that. And all of that would actually enrich a lot of environments by bringing a lot of different perspectives to any problem. That's often not what we really achieve, but that's what I'd consider the best case.
Can you all think of an example where has DEI worked well? If you can think of a place somewhere, whether it's a corporation, a K through 12 school, a college, somewhere where this program has really brought about something positive, the high attribution goals that we want for it, of something that population is diverse, and we do give a chance for there to be different representation there. Lee,
I want to, before anybody answers, I just want a clarification on what you're asking.
Okay.
Are you asking about the best case scenario after the installation of a specific DEI program, usually backed by a particular DEI bureaucracy? Or are you asking about, have we experienced any place that embraced diversity in a general sense, independent of whether or not the vice dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion is telling us what to do?
So this is why I'm so glad to be with social psychologists. I mean, that is. Thank you for parsing that out, really, because that's a total. Yes, I'll give you the good Jewish answer. On the one hand, yeah, where can we find a place? Let's say extracted. There's not an in-place DEI program where we have the proverbial, kind of infrastructure of a dean and of this, but they're actually living and doing a diverse. Living diversely, academically. And you're all academicians, so that feels like the most natural place to go, as opposed to corporate. And then I'd love to find an example of, no, this is a school, this is a place that has a DEI department and administrators, and it's working. So you can take either. You can go with just generally, yeah, this is a diverse place. We didn't need it. We didn't need an infrastructure because we're actually living it.
I'll throw out an easy one: professional baseball.
Great.
Yeah. If I was younger and more athletic, I would have an equal shot as everybody else on the planet for playing professional baseball.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great example. You look at baseball teams; they are very diverse by progressive standards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And no one's there because they got there unfairly or advantaged by their race or ethnicity or religion. They're there because they're better at baseball than everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I often think about that when I'm watching professional sports, as I think about the fact that these teams have no DEI department, not that I'm aware of anyway. To me, they are purely merit-based. If you can't sink the three-pointer appropriately the way that team needs you to sink that three-pointer, they're not so interested in you. Why would they be?
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to be the thorn in your side about how much is completely merit-based. So I've got a kid who did, a high level, the sort of elite level baseball all the way through to the end of high school. And oh my goodness, I cannot tell you how many hours, how many weekend trips, how many leaving work early, how many thousands of dollars we dumped into ensuring that he could play baseball at that level, right? So you're right that nobody's going to be if somebody shows up on the field with the merit, then they're just as likely to get to get selected for the team as anybody else. But who ends up on the field is still not something that's necessarily completely merit-based, because a lot of professional sports, a lot of sports in general, do end up needing resources for the kids who end up making it to that spot.
And I certainly know in any number of fields, you can imagine the rabbit and also of the rabbit. Like there is merit. There's also who you know. There's kind of political or social loyalties that folks, there's always more. And there's competition. There's generally, like, excuse the pun, how many spaces available are there in the field versus how many are coming into it too. Okay. Is it working anywhere? Do we have a diverse? Are there? Maybe it's not a realistic question to try to answer. That we can't.
Rutgers is one of the most diverse. The student body at Rutgers is one of the most diverse probably in the world.
And how do you think that came to be, Lee?
It came about naturally. I don't know how,
That's a virtue of being on
long before, I mean, they installed the DEI bureaucracy about 4 or 5 years ago. It was already more than half non-white. And the non-white part is a mix of different ethnicities. There's East Asians and South Asians, there's Black people, Latinos. They're not in exact representations to American demographics, but that's not the question. The question is, how diverse is it, and how did it get that way? And it's, and I don't know whether Rutgers used the kinds of admission criteria that were overturned by the Supreme Court. I don't know if there are big race ethnicity differences in SAT scores, for example. I don't have those data. But what I do know is that long before we had a DEI bureaucracy, the student body had been diversifying for a very long time. It was pretty substantially majority white when I got there, which was 1987. I mean, I don't remember those numbers. I think it was probably about 2/3. And now it is minority white. And most of that's organic.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I've been meaning to say, for those folks who are watching online, which are either on for ILV or Navi, the technology, please God, should work. That if you type in a comment, that we will get it over here on our side in the studio. So please, if you have questions or comments, feel free to drop that in, and we will monitor that as well. Listen, the NCRI study, which I'm always thrilled to hear, that's something that when it came out for us at Navi, I believe we were still operating under the title of Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. We thought there was all kinds of interesting, and there was a backstory in the fact that it was supposed to be covered, I think, by the New York Times, and they dropped the story. It was Bloomberg, somebody, I can't remember all. So, oh my God, there's a story about the story. And then Lee would say, well, not too many people were paying attention. My own institution doesn't realize it's happening. One of the things that you're talking about in this study is the kind of the backside of the unintended side effects of DEI. What have time out?
Wait, before you continue, I need to interrupt here briefly. I refer to them. Tanit and I were just talking about this about an hour ago. I don't like the term unintended side effects here, because if you read Kendi and D'Angelo, demonizing oppressor groups, white people in particular, but not only white people, is absolutely intentional. There's nothing unintentional about it. Now, it's an unannounced side effect. That is, when Rutgers or Harvard or Michigan or Google implements DEI, they're not blaring, time to demonize white people. That's not what they do, but that is what these interventions do, and there's nothing unintentional about it, as far as I can tell.
Thank you for that clarification.
This animus towards privileged groups, white people or white adjacent people like Asians and Jewish people, or men or straight people. Like this animosity is really deep inside the field, and it goes all the way back to the 60s and like the Frankfurt School. This has like long been simmering and building resentment, and it's intentional. Go back and read Herbert Marcuse's One Dimensional Man. This was get everybody as riled up as possible to get them to be the population that gets you your Marxist revolution. It's absolutely intentional, in their own words.
I really appreciate your clarification on that, and it is important. So with that as backdrop and proper phrasing, how does it play out in a real world example? Where do we see it manifest in the classroom or in a work environment? No one intended to make it the white man or straight to appear such and such a way, and yet now we have the consequences.
Well, I mean, there's a problem answering that question in that there's been almost no evaluation of these programs, no like rigorous scientific evaluation. So nobody really knows. Nobody can really give you like, you know, I mean, to some extent, the both the policy and the scientific question is, well, what good are they doing and what bad are they doing? And does the good outweigh the bad? And is the cost of doing it, you know, is what you're, even if the good does outweigh the bad, are the net benefits worth whatever cost? Nobody is, I know, and do you know anybody that's looked at it remotely like that?
Not very often, certainly not in DEI programs in these organizations. So
there's just no, you know, the people are just making stuff up to answer that. But what we do know is that there's been this dramatic rise in what you might call cancel culture or censorship throughout, or self-censorship throughout academia. And that's probably not exclusively, you can't point, you know, pinpoint all of that is coming from DEI, but some of it absolutely has come from DEI because of the demonization. And I'll give just one concrete example. Carol Hooven is a biologist who was at Harvard, and she made the mistake of going on Fox News where to argue that sex is biological and binary. The head of the DEI program in her department basically instigated an internal mob, created a hostile environment for her, which, you know, the authorities did not back her up. So, for example, the graduate students would no longer work for her. It's like, and so that she couldn't teach a course because she wouldn't have any TA. Now, it does raise the question, why the hell didn't the chair of the department look the grad students in the eye and say, you either work for her or we're taking away your funding, right? Because you're paid to be a TA. You don't want to be a TA? That's completely fine. You're unfunded now. But what happened was she was driven out.
And so what do you do when, in a case like that, if you go to her defense, now you're seen as somehow sexist or misogynistic or homophobic, the same way that if someone comes along and says, we need the DEI is not working, it is clearly having the effect that some of its original writers intended to have on the larger population. Now did I get that definition hopefully right? But by doing that, by coming out and saying that we want to have the DEI infrastructure taken down, now you're a racist. So how do you respond to that?
My answer is
hold on, Lee. I want to grab Ann or Danit if you want to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, I haven't heard. Yeah, you guys go. One of you.
Ann, why don't you go ahead?
So I'll comment on one thing, which is that this idea that, if you push back against some aspect of DEI, some consequence that you don't think is fair and that sort of thing, that you are immediately labeled either a racist, right, or a bigot of some sort, or it's chalked up as this inherent defensive that Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I've been involved at least adjacently in DEI spaces for a long time, from a bureaucracy kind of perspective. I've been an equity rep on hiring committees, this sort of thing. And much of the time it's pretty boring, right? It's not this kind of ideologically captured sort of thing. It's just kind of like making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. And over the last 5 or 6 years, since this new wave of DEI has really found its way into the mainstream, I have found that a lot of the discourse has gotten so much more toxic. And this is exactly what happens, right? So if you push back at all, if you criticize, even procedurally, right? Like, oh, you know what? Implicit bias training, that doesn't really work very well, right? Which it doesn't. Then you're labeled a racist for having said it, and that sort of thing. So, this is something that I think is really important, even for people who are proponents of DEI, to call out and to push back on, because one of the best ways to make sure that you are intellectually stagnant is to shut down all criticism, right? And that's basically what's happened in a lot of these DEI spaces.
Thanks, Anne. Denise, did you want to add something on that?
I agree with everything that's been said. Definitely piggybacking off of what Anne said, pushing back within the DEI bureaucracy that exists in these institutions is definitely a must. And wherever people can, to toe the line, to push it back to something less radical, and back to what it's supposed to be, I guess is like really necessary. And I do know also, these DEI programs that are supposed to create like they're supposed to be like the mediators of inclusive environment. I definitely saw after October 7th, that was non-existent for so many Jewish students on so many campuses. They didn't show up at all. In fact, a lot of them were at protests. So that just shows like how easy these runaway processes can get. And they say they're for something and they default on them. They default on these values.
Absolutely. And we've certainly since October 7th seen that widely. In fact, I was just reading a post this past week which kind of circles back a little to this idea of when one thing is taught in one place and it's not the goal of the program, and yet it is the you will excuse the expression, it is the unintended consequence, that what happened to Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania was simply the result, because the person who's committed the atrocity was saying, because he didn't like what Shapiro was going to do to the Palestinians, as if a state governor in the United States is going to have a huge impact on that. But it was to say, when you've got people out there marching against one population, it's going to have a ripple effect elsewhere, intended or otherwise, or intentional. So was this DEI business then, is it a scheme in some way? Was it set up in a way that it couldn't survive, or was what do we do? Like, what do we do with it? Is it a pyramid scheme? What is the DEI structure, and how would you, if you had a situation on your campus that you could help to restructure it somehow? I've heard new names that are being used. We're not calling it DEI anymore. We're now calling it communities of belonging. What would you do? Is the appropriate way just to knock it all down, or how do we recreate something that is potentially broken, or is it simply not worth it?
I think it's sort of, it's multiple scams in various ways. It's also things that aren't a scam, but in a lot of ways it is. So it's partially it's a vehicle to get far left radical political change, right? To bring down the entire structure to get this revolution. But then from like the DEI administrative point of view, it's a marketing tactic to bring in students and revenue, right? It's selling stuff to students to make them more likely to come there and spend their tuition dollars. So even though it's like this could be this very good thing, in some ways is like baseball, What gets abused is just like everything. Everybody uses it as all kinds of shield. And what's great about being a DEI advocate is literally become a priest. And if anybody ever disagrees with you on anything, you get to say, you are a racist, you are a sexist, you are a misogynist, you are a transphobe, you are a homophobe. And you can destroy people's lives with snapping your fingers. It's a power that is just so easily abused that it becomes a scam, in my opinion.
And you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Please.
part of the reason it becomes hard to have that conversation, right, about is it a scam or not, is that it's not like it's just one thing. So people have come to DEI programs from a lot of different perspectives. I do think that there's a real ideological stream that has had more and more influence in recent years. But there's also just a lot of people who are, doing their managerial stuff in universities, and they're supposed to hit targets that somebody has told them they're supposed to be hitting, and so on. And so in many cases, the strategies that are implemented are not even all that well thought out. They're just saying, well, we have to do something. So what's that something that we have to do? And what the something is ends up being pretty diverse, like different places do different things. And I think that one of the reasons that we're seeing more and more of these kind of extreme DEI approaches is that a lot of times the people who are in charge of doing something are not experts in it. Right. So you'll have upper level administrators, they're kind of deers in headlights. They don't know what to do. And so well, who's the expert? Right. And who do you reach for? Who's the expert? It's often going to be the person who's most deeply into critical theory or something like that. Right. So then the answers that you get, and then people who are brought in to help you develop policy in some cases will be the extremists. So when you get those two things kind of aligning, you end up with, I'd say, sometimes the worst case scenarios. Having said that, I want to just at least make a case for some of the better case scenarios, right? So to the extent that there are, I think, good examples of DEI, they're often ones that are not one size fits all, right? So you could have an organization that identifies that there's some kind of problem, right? So people are not getting promoted at similar rates. Is this actually due to bias, or is this just because, not everybody's interested in the same promotions, that sort of thing. And so, in many cases, the recommendation would be, okay, well, let's evaluate what's going on. Let's figure out whether there's something wrong with the process. And if there is something wrong with the process, then develop some kind of a system to try to address that, right? Lee mentioned some of the kinds of practices that you might actually do that are a lot more, I think, pretty reasonable and equitable. So things like paying attention to where you're recruiting from. So are you always going to the Ivy League schools that might be not that representative of the general population when you're recruiting for positions? How is mentoring happening at your organization? Are you making sure that mentoring isn't just because, people who look like you, or, people they sort of feel a connection with in some way are the ones who end up in your social group? Same thing can happen with stuff like referrals for different kinds of positions. So anytime there's a network internally, you have to be just kind of aware of the ways in which that might end up playing out that could reproduce certain kinds of biases, even if they're not intended. So I think that there are a number of ways that that DEI has been done more effectively. Dobbin and Calev have a book called Getting to Diversity, and I think that at least a lot of their practices are a little bit more common sense. They identify these kinds of things, and they actually do evaluate whether they work or not, right? But most of those are not things like critical theory, and things like reading Kendi and D'Angelo and that sort of thing. I think there's really no evidence at all that those work, and there's, I think, increasing evidence that they're counterproductive.
I agree with that.
So
Yeah.
the University of Michigan actually has an answer to this question. Like, what should we do? And I personally, I think this is the single best answer that's out there so far. The University of Michigan recently announced that it's getting rid of its entire DEI program bureaucracy. And what they said publicly, I don't know how much they're done, but I think what they're saying is the right thing. They're taking most of that money and they're applying it to financial support for meritorious students from disadvantaged backgrounds. this is great. This is absolutely great. Yeah, it's not illegal. You're going to disproportionately sweep up high-performing Black and Latino kids because they're going to be disproportionately poor. And Americans have long been strongly behind, some level of support for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. There's I don't know if it's quite a consensus, but there's always been a lot of support for that. It doesn't run up against civil rights law, and you don't need a gigantic bureaucracy. In fact, you don't need really any additional bureaucracy because universities already have mechanisms for funding students. It's just and it's concrete. If you take whatever, I don't know how many tens of millions of dollars Michigan was spending, and you take, 60% of that, and you're now spending it on financial aid, you're admitting 200 students to your university who otherwise wouldn't be coming. That is a concrete outcome that is tangible in a way that, most of this other stuff is so fuzzy. Even if you evaluate it, it's difficult.
I agree with that too.
Let's just do a quick walk around in your institutions, because we have represented here. We've got Rutgers, so we got New Jersey, we've got Arkansas, and we've got Ontario represented. What is it? How much of an issue is this in your campuses? Or is this just, mental gymnastics that a handful of people are spinning around about, and then the media grabs the extreme to blow it up? What do you see actually on your campuses? And I'd also love to hear, just on a very personal level, what do you guys teach? What are your students interested in learning that you're experiencing, either undergraduate and or graduate? Nate, you want to start us off?
I'm currently just doing research. And actually, it's interesting because our department is independently funded in certain ways so that we can't be attacked by sort of this left-wing activism. And that was sort of very intentionally done that way. And so we're a very empirical, positive, data-driven program. And we required outside protection to be able to do our work and actually look at real data and real evidence and not be smashed from the outside by political forces. So we're actually a very unique, very wonderful department down here.
And the full name of your department it's something about educational reform. Yeah. What does that mean?
So
what are you trying to reform, in other words?
K-12, higher education. We have people working on everything from teacher salaries to recruitment to figuring out how to balance put different political viewpoints in discussions. How can you have radical left-wing activist scholars and conservative, data-driven people and moderate liberals and moderate non-political people? How can you create spaces on campuses for all these people to engage one another productively? We're all over the place for education.
Well, and this is now speaking with my North American Values Institute hat on, which is we're watching teachers' colleges in particular, and where education has become social activism or political activism.
Oh, yeah.
How are you addressing that?
So actually, two of my favorite books ever were by Christina Hoff Sommers, Who Stole Feminism and the War Against Boys. So the activists went after the education colleges in the 90s, and they got them, and then now it's become institutionally left-wing activism-based education at pre-K through PhD for the last 30 years. And I love Christina Hoff Sommers. I'm a huge fan.
She is a friend of ours, and someone that absolutely we follow, and we're seeing what's happening in teachers' colleges on a host of issues, literally as we speak. What's going on up in Ontario? What are you seeing?
So I'd say a lot of things, and I don't know if I can answer this in a
14 seconds. Here we go.
So I'd say just organically, the diversity, the equity, and I think that things are going in the right direction by and large, just simply by having increased opportunity for more people, right? So overall, I think that things have gotten better and better. As they've gotten better and better, and to some extent, that also has been because of intentional practices, right? Like making sure that there are certain things that have been in place to eliminate barriers that had been holding people back. So in my department, for example, when I was first hired, we had a chair for a decade or more prior to that who was known to have said that, why would you ever hire a woman of childbearing age? Like, why would you ever do that? Right. So it's not like there's none of that. Like there still are things that need to get addressed here and there. But I think that generally things have gotten better and better. At the same time, because there's more and more attention to equity and diversity in Canada, indigeneity is another big issue, right? So Indigenous people have been systemically disadvantaged in so many ways that there are a lot of programs that are intentionally targeting specific groups. And I have really mixed views about that, but it's essentially what Lee was talking about before that I think would be illegal in the US, right? So hiring people on the basis of their demographic characteristics. So this is one of the practices that's happening in hiring in academia. It's often not determined by the universities themselves, but rather by the federal government. So there will be funding that's put in place for hiring chairs of various demographic groups, for example. So you need to hire a Black scholar for this position, an Indigenous scholar for this position, and a gender minority for this position, and that sort of thing. So we do have quite a bit of controversy around those sorts of things, and I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, on the ground, at least, the sort of thing that I often see is a lot more sensible. So in my department, I'm actually one of the co-chairs for our equity committee. It's called JEDI, Justice and EDI. And I'm very intentionally focused on the ways that we can do things that promote equity for everyone. Right. So we spend a lot of time talking about things like, what's the hidden curriculum that people who are first generation students are less likely to know about? If you don't know the ropes, do you end up being less likely to be able to make it to get into the honors thesis stage? Are there ways that we can try to make sure that people have equal access and that they don't feel like this is a route that's not for them? Reminding faculty when they're selecting students, for example, that somebody might not have had the opportunity to do unpaid internships if they're working 30 hours a week, right? So evaluating those sorts of things. And I think a lot of those goes back to what Lee said about Michigan, that many of the things that we talk about as being racial inequities really fundamentally at this stage are more socioeconomic inequities, right? So if we can be addressing things that are really down to that, then I think that you can actually do them in a way that also is perceived as much more fair, because it's going to benefit people from every group if they have those socioeconomic disadvantages.
I would sit on Anne's JEDI committee. There are very few DEI committees that I'd willingly serve on, but I would serve on Anne's.
That is
a group of my peers have been referring to ourselves as scholars into teaching heterodoxy, or SIT. They're playing on that whole thing.
That's really nice, and we can imagine the costumes that would be available with these committees. But I think that this gets back to pay attention. One of the things that, again, that we're trying to look at it, Navi, is radical DEI. When it's thoughtful, if it's nuanced, as we're paying attention, indeed, as we know, it's often more socioeconomic than anything else. Not so much race or gender. It's not that those things are irrelevant, but the socioeconomic landing, that tends to be one we hit on. I don't know if that Lee or Danit, if you wanted to mention anything going on at Rutgers in terms of what you're seeing and or what you're actually teaching. I realize, Danit, that you are en route, still as a graduate student. But what do you see on campus? Anything of note?
I'll pass this to Lee, the professor.
Well, over the last 7 years, I spent 4 years chairing psychology, 1 year chairing anthropology, and a year on sabbatical. So I have done very little classroom teaching over the last 6 or 7 years. So the last course I taught was on protest and radicalization. And not only did that have a bunch of grad students in it, it had people from around the country actually sitting in on it, not for credit. That was a great class to teach. People are, it's like, what the hell is going on? What the hell is going on?
I think
they want to know.
Yeah. And
plus Lee draws that kind of crowd. Like, people show up for Lee.
So what were was there like a capstone, or there was some kind of a project students had to write? Were there any of note of what people saw or what they were drawing their conclusions on about protest and
Yeah, there was some light writing. I didn't have them do some like big project or anything like that. So, although there were some, two or three of the students were working with me at the time, and we had projects that emerged or were informed by some of the stuff we did in that class. That's true.
So listen, if there are any other points that folks want to raise up, and I haven't seen any comments in our comment section, so I don't know, either the tech isn't flowing in from X and YouTube, or we have answered all the questions in the universe, and therefore they're not coming in. If we wanted to do just one kind of a closing question or statement, if people wanted to make, so what would your hope be if in a world where it may well be that the Trump administration comes in and really all the DEI departments need to shut down and it's simply not going to exist anymore, so it's a non-issue. But how do we work for our institutions, whether it's a K through 12, whether it's a college environment, a corporation, a synagogue? How do we effectively try to create a diverse environment?
I'll go first. So no, I mean, right, because left wing or academia is so left wing now and so far to the left, and there's almost no conservatives left. And I think there might be two fields in the entire world where they're even a majority, like military science and theology. It's going to have to be something like racial desegregation in the 60s to bring conservative and heterodox views into the university system. And you're going to protect them when they say things because the activists do not want them there and they will not tolerate them being there.
Yeah, adding political ideology to the protected list.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you both. Political ideology, allowing for conservative voices, different thoughts. So really, when we talk about diversity, that we are including ideological heterodoxy.
Very much.
Great.
Yeah, that's not going to happen organically within academia.
No, it's going to be forced.
Well, it has to be imposed from the outside, and that comes with its own dangers, as we're seeing now.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that having a recommitment to being open to these different perspectives, right? You can have diverse views at the university, but if some of them just keep getting squashed, right? That, if you have a dissenting view, then you're automatically assumed to be acting in bad faith and so on. Then even the views that are there end up really just getting chilled and they don't feel comfortable speaking up. So I think that really recommitting to that, if we could do that from the inside, that would be far better than having it imposed from the outside. I've been yelling that at my university for years now. I was on a free speech committee about, 5 or 6 years ago now. And one of my most interesting experiences there was going to the town hall to talk about our free speech commitments and being called a white supremacist for supporting free speech and being called on to resign from the university, right? So these are things, there's a lot of resistance from some relatively, I think, a minority view, but a very loud view that resists that kind of openness. I do think, though, that at least over the last few years, that students are really hungry for more of this. They're kind of done with the hyper wokeness. A few years ago, they weren't. Now they are. And if you signal that you're open to different views, that you're open to be disagreed with, that you want to see debate happening, that you like the idea of approaching disagreement, right? Like, let's listen to the person who's got the exact opposite perspective. They're really hungry for that. So I'm quite hopeful, actually, that we may start to see the tides turn. I'm less hopeful that whatever happens with the Trump administration is going to do that. And I will say just one thing to highlight, I'm in Canada, so we're seeing this from a little bit of a distance. But I will say that a lot of people in this space, and this includes a lot of students and a lot of people who are in what you might call marginalized groups, are understanding this Trump reaction to be one grounded in hate. And I think they're wrong. But it still feels that way to them. Now, I'm not going to say no one on the Trump side is hateful. There's going to be a variety of reasons, but I think that a lot of the backlash, a lot of the push to dismantle DEI at universities and so on, if you look at what's happening, it's really not because the goal is to roll us back to pre-civil rights era, right? It's not that, and that often ends up getting caricatured as what the goal is, that anybody who is critical of DEI, it's because they don't want diversity, they don't want equity, and they don't want inclusion. And if that's how you're understanding it, then you might really feel that you're in a very unwelcoming kind of world. And so one of the things I really try to do is to emphasize to students that that's really not where a lot of people are coming from, and that there's a lot less hate out there than they might have been told. Because we have to do that if we want to be able to stay open to having discourse across these different perspectives.
So, Anne, I actually, perhaps surprisingly, partially disagree. So I think they are misattributing the target of the hate. So in that sense, I think you're right. It's not hatred of minorities or trans people or whatever. That's not the target of the hate. The target of the hate is progressives, and especially progressive academics. And they do hate us. And they are, as far as I can tell, they are on a quest to corrode academia's ability to function and to be an engine of progressive politics. And to do that, they are willing to take down much of the constructive value of academia to make that happen. So I think I think hate is involved, but it's not, the target is not, the idea is not to bring us back to pre-civil rights. It is to destroy a major pillar of progressivism in the United States. That's what I think the purpose. And I think that is hate driven, but that is also hate evoked because academics have been hateful, have been uninhibited in expressing the amount they despise as both incompetent and depraved anyone to the right of a mainstream Democrat. And that's been going on for long before Trump. And so if you go around expressing hate towards a certain people for a long enough period of time, eventually they get the message. And now this group has gotten the message and is throwing this hate back at us.
And so J.D. Vance has said the universities are the enemy. Said it in public, means it, and he's very likely to be the president in 4 years. What people hate is the speech codes. You must say this, you must say that, you must always have these beliefs. You are forbidden from using these words, you are forbidden from saying that, you are forbidden from hanging out with your friends and having these jokes. That's what they hate. And they don't want to go back to the 50s and 40s, they want to go back to the 90s. They want to go back to like when you could hang out with people and say what you really think and have fun and be in mixed, that's where they want to get back to. And they hate this ever-present control over everything they say or do or think. That's what they hate. That's what pissed them off.
I completely agree. And I'd say, well, that a lot of that contempt, that hate started in the universities, right? Mm-hmm. We've been teaching that you should be contemptuous of the white working class and of conservatives, and they're pathologically terrible. They're evil. So, we're playing a role in that, and that's how these cycles of polarization and radicalization happen, because we just keep feeding off of the worst of what the other side believes about us, and it gets we justified in continuing that cycle of contempt.
I agree.
So as someone who was in graduate school in the 1990s, I wouldn't mind going back so much. In fact, I remember in my before I went to rabbinical school, I was getting a master's degree in history, and one of my classes was on the history of philosophy or something along those lines. And I remember that in this, and it was kind of the era, early 90s, of multiculturalism. And I remember our philosophy professor came in, he said, I just heard this term of someone who is, we want a gender neutral term for not a waiter or a waitress, but a waitrix. And he just laughed, and we just laughed about it. And we just, now he'd be sued, he'd be kicked out of the university, he'd lose his tenure, and like no one should ever read his books anymore. And anyone who's a graduate student who laughed at the joke, we'd probably be kicked out as well. Like the whole thing. And what I was thinking, because I can't help but have it go figure, I can't help but have a Jewish lens when I bring something. As I'm thinking about, because we just came through Passover, and there's the matzah that we eat on Passover. This very thin cracker-like thing that the bread didn't have time to rise as the Israelites were leaving Egypt and all that. And there's this line that we say about the matzah is this is the bread of affliction, which it is, because it reminds us when we were slaves, and yet it's also the bread of freedom because we ate it on our way because we were becoming free. So which is it? Is it the bread of affliction? Is it the bread of freedom? Again, the Jewish, yes, it's both. We hold both opinions, and consistently in Jewish life we say this is what this word means in the Torah or whatever it is, and then we'll have this expression davar acher. Here's another teaching which may be completely contradictory to it. They're put right next to each other on the page. They're right there. Mm-hmm. Now, one of them might have been more of a minority opinion, right? That when it comes to deciding things legally in Jewish law, no, that's a minority opinion. We record it. That's not actually what we do. But we hold on to it. And what has to be careful is that minority, that vocal minority, if we're not going back to some radical ideologies and things in our own day, to be careful that doesn't override what is the majority and what makes sense in this case. And yet we have to hold both at the same time. And while I think, Anne, you brought a really important point when you're talking about, Lee, you said, there's a real genuine hatred that is coming at academicians right now and at the academy. Hence, Nate, why you said what Vice President Vance said, right, about the university. And yet Trump's election signals a support by people who do not hate the ideas of diversity and equity and inclusion. They're not haters. They get targeted as such, but that's not what they are. It's a complex reality. And so I think we're living in a time right now. I'm grateful for all of your thoughtfulness on this, because we have to be able to talk and see, and there's no one solution to DEI. But we need to call it out where it's not going well. Nate, you look like you were ready to say something. No.
No. So I think Trump won the majority of Hispanics. I want to say, and I don't have the data in front of me, but I know that every demographic shifted towards Trump from his 2016 victory.
It did.
Yeah, and actually, there's actually Black MAGA rap culture that I've been totally fascinated with since like 2018. But that's a rabbit hole we don't need to go down.
We will all Google that after the show.
Yeah. That's for the post podcast. Great, friends. If there unless there are any other comments that anyone wanted to make, I just want to close. Are there any other comments? So thank you for joining us tonight, and folks who are watching us online or watch the recording. Nate Bork, Danit Finkelstein, Lee Justum, and Ann Wilson. How grateful the Institute for Liberal Values and the North American Values Institute are for having you on this program, and more broadly, for your writing and your teaching and the research that you offer. In a world where it is just far too easy to choose black or white, no pun intended, you are making life much more gray, which is good for our gray matter. And indeed, speaking as a rabbi, our souls, as we know that life and humanity and education and perspective are complex. They're nuanced. And as one of my teachers called it, they create the sacred messiness of life. If you are not currently a follower or subscriber of the Institute for Liberal Values and or the North American Values Institute, please check out our websites. We both tag and code at IL Values and Navi Values. You are smart people. You can find us. And if you're so inclined to support our work, the donate button is only all too ready to receive your generosity so we can keep our institutes and conversations like this meaningful, relevant, and most importantly, present. So with that, I wish everyone a good night. Really, thank you so much, Nate and Ann and Danit and Lee, really for your work and for having a conversation with one another and staying in this field. So wishing everyone a good night. This concludes our program for tonight. Thank you.
Night. Thank you.
Baruch Hashem. Thank you. Hatzlacha.
See you all.
Are we done? Are we out of here?